Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us today for the second part of a session looking at the sects and the broad left fronts. They are very much related. I think I thought it would be an idea to quickly recap sort of takeaway points from last week, because that was a pretty very good meeting, I thought. So we had a sort of definition and discussion around sects. Sects are not defined by the size. You can have a small sect, you can have a big sect. Often they pursue a particular long-held doctrine or ideology, which is used to explain why they have to be in a different group from another. Often that's related to the Soviet Union. But that's becoming less important. There's no real democracy as we would think is necessary. For example, most sects make a difference between the right to express differences internally. That's fine, but not externally. So you can't possibly have differences in the newspaper, for example. There's no right of permanent factions. That's pretty much linked to that issue. Moshe, I thought, gave a very succinct, short definition. And he said a sect wouldn't get involved in the fusion process. It wouldn't want to fuse with other organizations because they tend to think they're it already. Just join us. We have to grow a little bit. We also had an interesting short discussion around that very famous definition that some people think is a definition for sectarianism from the Communist Manifesto. That asked socialist organizations not to pursue interests that are separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. That's often used to say, "Oh, you're a sectarian and you're not doing that." Moshe Machova said quite rightly that's not a very useful definition, because no sect actually believes its interests are separate from that of the working class. And often that quote from the Communist Manifesto of the Communist Party of Germany, is used to claim, wrongly obviously, that Marx and Engels were against forming a communist party and that socialists should instead stick to the Labour Party and or subordinate themselves to the sub-reformist platitudes of the latest broad front set up by this or that sect. There's the connection, obviously. So today we're looking at the broad fronts that are often led by what we would call sects. And I'm very pleased to have with us two speakers tonight. Kat's having some trouble logging in, but she's the second speaker anyway. So first speaker tonight is Marcus Strom, who's joining us from Australia, where it's very, very early. Thank you for joining us that early, Marcus. He was very involved in the Socialist Alliance here in Britain when he used to live in Britain, and also knows a thing or two about respect. So we're going to start with you, comrade. Thank you for joining us.
Be with you. I will get to the point. So today I want to argue the main reason that the broad fronts of the left fail is fundamentally a failure of program and perspective, and I'll go into that. First of all, a bit of a definition. The broad lefts are the idea that the left should focus on the 80% where it agrees and suppress the rest of it in the interest of unity. So it tends to be a unity of the lowest common denominator, which means unity around reforms alone and not unity around a perspective of changing society in general. Where do they come from? So I think they come out of the failure of not only the communist movement of the 20th century, but also the broad reformist socialist ideas of the 20th century, which were driven apart and smashed really by the realities of the 70s and 80s. Although these broad left ideas even existed then, the ideas really came out of the popular front of the 1930s and 40s. And what they have in common with those earlier manifestations of broad leftism is really a drive to make sure that the right wing is on board. And so everything is geared to suppressing dissent, idea, debate, or activity that might upset the right wing, whether that's, the fictitious idea of the Archbishop of Canterbury. Got to keep the Archbishop of Canterbury on board. Got to keep the different writers on board, the church on board. Got to keep areas to the right on board. Is really what drives a lot of, and that drives the program. That drives the internal democracy of these left groups. They have in common a suppression of democracy in order to keep the right wing on board. So why re-emerging now? I mean, in the British context, Kat will probably be able to give a better understanding. But from a high level, it appears that it's re-emerging now because in Britain, Labor is in government and Corbynism has failed. So Corbynism kind of suppressed an external Labor broad left. Everyone was jumping into back Corbynism, and so that had its own broad left logic to it itself. Underlying it all, of course, is what you might call a nascent anti-imperialism, anti-war movement, which has bubbled along with, particularly within Britain, but within Western Europe and to some extent Australia, for 30, 40 years, really since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the drive of initially the neocons and then other parts of imperialism, when the idea of a Pax Americana with the collapse of the Soviet Union sort of evaporated, and in the blood of, you know, 1 million Iraqis, and in the sands of the Middle East, you saw US imperialism with British and Australian and other forces joining in on the Iraq War. The real emergence of an anti-war movement, much of which was driven by far left groups or sects, acting as the backbone, particularly in Britain, the SWP at the time, really did create prompt a suggestion. Well, how do we get these movements to go further? What is the political expression of these? How do they impact not beyond just massing people on the streets opposing war? I was on the big anti-war march in 2003 against Iraq, 1 or 2 million people in London, and people around the world. And of course, Blair and Bush ignored it all and went to war. So it prompts the question of, well, what politics is needed in order to turn the anti-war sentiment, anti-capitalist sentiment, which was even bubbling around, into a political force. So most of the proponents of such blocks, whether they're in sects or not, believe the question of reform or revolution can be left open-ended in any such formation. You see this early on in organizations, probably like Die Linke in Europe, Rifondazione Comunista, which really fell apart after the compromises over the Afghan war, with the various attempts in France, even probably now with the new Popular Front. You definitely saw it in the Socialist Alliance and Respect, and watching from afar the sort of litany left unity in various groups that bubbled along to a lesser extent after the collapse of Respect. So, and with this question of reform or revolution left open-ended, it is through the revolutionary organizations embedded in them fighting for reforms or demands in the most revolutionary way that Marxists can display the superiority of revolutionary methods. I think that's at the core of the idea. I think this is a complete abandonment, not only of Marxist method, but of the Marxist program. So Marxism, the idea is that the working class in capitalist society can lead a democratic revolution to overthrow the existing order and open the way to the end of class society. This is not a recipe for just being the best activist for reforms. It is actually a political program of class hegemony and class power. For the advocates of broad lefts, the Marxist program is really a thing of shame, not to be disclosed to the mass of the class in elections, certainly not a general framework to organize the working class or a general strategy to conquer state power, starting from today and into the future. It's not a roadmap to power, the Marxist program. For these people, it seemed the Marxist program is something only to be revealed during a revolutionary situation. And before then, it is really only something used to ordain chosen acolytes at university fresher fairs, or, you know, secret, semi-secret meetings at the end of anti-war demonstrations. Come along to our meeting and we'll tell you what we really think. We see this in, the Socialist Party's attitude to task counterfires attitude to an emergent post-Corbyn movement, which is happening now. Saw it in spades during the days of the Socialist Labour Party, of which I was a member, the Socialist Alliance, of which I was a member, the Scottish Socialist Party. I did go to a couple of conferences representing the London Socialist Alliance to the SSP. I almost got booed at one of those meetings, I think. And Respect, of course. So yes, as outlined by the subject of this talk, all these broad left fronts have failed. I think to help understand why, it's worth looking at a couple of things written by John Rees at the time of the Socialist Alliance in the early noughties, which I went back and had a look at. Obviously, I don't agree with the conclusions or the theoretical framework proposed by Comrade Rees then or now, but I would say at least he tried to theorise the SWP's turn to electoral work, the Socialist Alliances, and then Respect. Obviously led later into a split after the Respect project failed in the SWP. That was part of it, but he was really the theorist in chief of the SWP around these questions. I think that general framework still guides the work of the Cliffites in general, if not explicitly, then at least implicitly. And we see it in Australia with the Socialist Alliance, the Socialist Alternative Organisation's Victorian Socialist electoral work. In a by-election recently, that the Victorian Socialists got 7.4% of the vote on a broad left platform, which is a good result, just below the Greens 7.9% in Western Melbourne, working class area. The Labor Party did hang on to hold that seat, but very much they were wounded. And I also think you see that sort of framework of Rees in Chris Ninen's recent contribution to the Prometheus theory series on the party, where the idea that the Revolutionary Party emerges magically during a revolutionary situation to become the mass party from being this semi-secret group within broad left fronts. And the only other real attempt at the time, I think, to theorize these types of outfits came from the Mandelites in Europe, the United Secretariats. They talked about parties of recomposition, really. But while for John Rees, the Socialist Alliance and similar was posited as a united front of this is a quote, of a particular kind applied to the electoral field. He said, this is in 2001, he wrote this united front of a particular kind, quote, seeks to unite left reformist activists and revolutionaries in a common campaign around a minimum program. It seeks to provide a socialist alternative to the right-wing dominated Labor Party on the basis of a series of fundamental working class demands which are common to those who come from the Labor Party and those who are revolutionaries. In formal programmatic terms, there is not a very great distinction between the kinds of policies that would be advanced by a revolutionary organisation presenting an electoral platform and those of the Socialist Alliance. But the method of organisation is substantially different. And again, further to reinforce this point, it's all about organisation, not program. He says a second point that Trotsky makes here is of great contemporary relevance. It is through joint struggle that the differences between revolutionaries and reformists become apparent to reformist workers. It is not in the first instance because revolutionaries differentiate themselves or can oppose themselves to the reformists inside the United Front that reformist workers are drawn to them. It is rather because revolutionaries show in practice that their methods of struggle are superior, more consistent and effective, etc. And this leads reformist workers becoming more open to revolutionary politics, whatever they are. They just seem to be really, really well-organized reforms. And he said that the alliance structure, the virtue of the alliance structure of the United Front approach, rather than declaring a new party, is it allows this work to continue without posing immediately and point blank whether the supporters of this organisation see themselves as revolutionaries or reformists. So it becomes a unique forum for participation between left reformists and revolutionaries at a high level of general political generalisation around a socialist program rather than a single issue. So basically, that's a fancy way of saying we want to create a fishing pool in which to recruit from. And when people do want to become revolutionaries, it isn't in the broad organisation of the working class. They do this, they just join our group because we are the revolutionaries already. This was contested really by people like Alan Thornett, Murray Smith, and others who are around. I think they're in. Well, Alan's not with us anymore, but others. That strand is now an anti-capitalist resistance, and they argued that the Scottish Socialist Party and the Socialist Alliance were better understood as parties of recomposition. And we saw this tension really in the Socialist Alliance. The Socialist Alliance became real in London when I was I think I was chair of the London Socialist Alliance when the SWP joined. Soon afterwards, the Socialist Party left because they lost control because the SWP had more members. So Murray Smith wrote in response to Rees in 2002 that to the extent that the SWP approaches the SSP and the Socialist Alliance in the spirit of being the revolutionary component of the United Front or the revolutionary faction within a centrist party, it will have difficulty functioning in a constructive way. It is much better to build it towards a party. But again, a party of what type? For the USEC lot, it was a party of recomposition. What they had in common was that reform and revolution were left open. For both these comrades, they thought they were disagreeing, but what unites them is that their Trotskyist program is not useful for day-to-day politics. It is only a revolutionary program for revolutionary people in revolutionary times, as they might have said in Royston Vasey. So what they fundamentally miss, I think, is that the Marxist program is a political program for the workers' movement today. It lays out a minimum set of demands, technically feasible under the current society, but can only be implemented in full through the rule of the working class. But for our Trotskyite and Cliffite comrades, the revolutionary situation means workers spontaneously form workers' councils or something like this, and then just turn these into organs of state power, presumably not because of any programmatic methodology from the today into this period, but precisely because of their superior methods of organization. And I think you see this in Chris Ninen's essay recently in Prometheus. And then you can drop all the rubbish about standing in elections and Parliament can just be dropped because then you just turn into a storming the Winter Palace reenactment society. So I've been rereading State Revolution for a reading group in Australia, and I thought it was a bit of a weird choice, given it was written in the heat of such a revolutionary period that our comrades believe is when a revolutionary program is relevant. In chapter 4, it focuses on supplementary explanations by Engels. And Lenin writes in this bit, Engels, talking about the housing question and the critique of the Erfurt program, that's kind of the context. Lenin wrote then, quote, Engels realized here in a particularly striking form the fundamental idea which runs through all of Marx's works, namely that the democratic republic is the nearest approach to the dictatorship of the proletariat. For such a republic, without in the least abolishing the rule of capital and therefore the oppression of the masses, and the class struggle inevitably leads to such an extension, development, unfolding, and intensification of this struggle that as soon as it becomes possible to meet the fundamental interests of the oppressed masses, this possibility is realized inevitably and solely through the dictatorship of the proletariat, through the leadership of those masses by the proletariat. These two are the forgotten words of Marxism. I thought that was quite striking that here, right before the Bolsheviks took power, Lenin is reminding us that it is the democratic republic that is the form and that is really the keystone of our political program. And that is through the fighting for the realization of the democratic republic and the minimum program in total, that the working class is able to really implement its full program and become the ruling class. Which so he goes on to explore different state forms possible within a republic. Lenin says that the Marxist program is not indifferent to the state form. It doesn't just say workers' councils will solve it all, as you seem to get shorthand in most of the far left these days. So for the broad left formation, it just creates a revolutionary crisis somewhere down the track. This is the program. The broad left does it form a government, is a mass, or anyway, then the real answer will be on the streets and the demonstrations, and and that's where the revolutionaries will show their superior form of organization, and then workers' councils will pop up. But no, Lenin said, far from being indifferent to the forms of state, Engels, on contrary, tried to analyze the transitional forms with the most utmost thoroughness in order to establish, in accordance with the concrete historical peculiarities of each particular case, from what and to what the given transitional form is passing. Lenin then goes into a discussion of some places a federal republic is relevant, in some places a unified republic is relevant, but the center of it is the state. I would say I'll come to a wind up soon, but the John Rees does hang on to kernels of Marxism in those early articles he was writing 23, 24 years ago now. There he says, participation in parliamentary elections by revolutionaries can be a method of increasing the consciousness and combativity of the working class. Exactly the opposite of the effect desired by the establishment defenders of the parliamentary system. For as long as workers look to parliamentary democracy to remedy their grievances within the capitalist system, revolutionaries will find an audience for their views by standing in elections. He points out the Bolsheviks were still standing in parliamentary elections after the October Revolution to the Constituent Assembly. And critically, he makes this point. It's almost in passing, but it's really at the kernel of the problem. So he said the Socialist Alliance is not simply an electoral intervention by a revolutionary organization in the way described by the Communist International or practiced by the SWP in the 70s. I think he's wrong. He's got the idea there. You just put out your full revolutionary program and you get poor votes, is what he thinks there. That's his experience of the SWP in the 1970s. He says, nor is it even an electoral intervention by an alliance of the revolutionary left, such as the French Ligue Communiste Révolutionnaire and Lutte Ouvrière tried, a list despite some desires of far left groups in the alliance. I think that's a reference to the CPGB. Certainly, the participation of most of the revolutionary left in United Campaign has been an important precondition of its success. So without the SWP and the far left groups, the Marxist groups, the socialist alliances would never have been real. And this, he says here, this is partly because the British electoral system, but I would argue any electoral system, punishes division especially harshly. More importantly, the effect of a united campaign by the far left attracts many more beyond their own ranks. Unity stands as an emblem of the seriousness of the enterprise. I think that's a really important point, and I think that is what advocates of Marxist unity argue, is that we are treated with disdain quite rightly by the working class because we're so disunited, and that unity does stand as an emblem of the seriousness of the enterprise. But for Rees, unity is not around Marxism, but around reformism. So Rees identifies the core of the problem, and this is something I've heard Mike McNair and Jack Conrad and others have been banging on about lately. The working class knows it needs unity and it punishes disunity. But unity around what? The default is a left reformist framework, the 80% on which we agree, Corbynism, etc., etc. In reality, such outfits just become fish traps for the host revolutionary group to recruit from. In Australia, the Socialist Alternative is standing on a left reformist sub-political program, practically indistinguishable from the Green Party. Again, for our Antipodean Cliffites, it's the fact that revolutionaries fight for these reformist minimum programs more militantly that proves the superiority of their methods, not the theoretical and organic link between the minimum program and the maximum program. So, and when the revolution comes, how, it's not clear, just by building bigger and bigger demonstrations, I assume, workers will instinctively be drawn to the group that fights for change most consistently. I actually think this is as deep as their theory is, and I actually think it comes from almost a sociological revulsion for much of the left that it actually doesn't want to build an organization that rules society. I think sociologically, and maybe this is for another chat, not this one, I think a lot of the far left at the moment, maybe because of how fringe and small it is attracted by people who are sociologically they just hate current society. I mean, they're not positive about what sort of society we have and will want to rule with the working class, but actually they just hate capitalism. They hate this, they hate that, sort of like a Kevin the teenager grump at the world. But our understanding of Marxism is a million miles from this. The minimum program is designed as a roadmap to state power for the working class, not a series of increasingly radical incremental steps to fool workers into accidentally taking power. Like this is the so-called transitional method. At its apex is the demand for a democratic Republican state form and all that flows from that throughout society, throughout all our demands, including within the workers' movement itself. So what Rees does identify is that the disunity of the left is death and is punished. But we need to unite around a Marxist program. Now, I want to finish now just saying the subheading of the meeting was it's the 20% on which we disagree that matters. I'm not sure that this is the case. We want a mass party. We want a broad party, but around a Marxist program. So we want tens, hundreds of thousands, millions of people. And it will be around that 80% we agree on within Marxism, I would hope. But we also want a culture where the 20% we disagree, it does matter, but it is not taboo to discuss it, where we can have debates around our disagreements, but we have unity, disciplined unity around implementing the program, not a police unity, not an enforced unity from the top table in order to keep the right wing on board. That is why these left unity projects continually fail. Look at what happened in Respect. The broad leftists want to suppress disagreements between revolutionaries and reformists. They don't want to show the theoretical superiority of Marxist ideas. Their idea is just by getting up earlier and being more active, putting out better banners and showing you're the best organizer of the demonstration, that somehow shows our methods are better. That way we don't upset the reformists and we keep them on board. So hence we have the ludicrous spectacle of the SWP voting against open borders, voting against a republic, voting against a woman's right to control her own body at the founding meeting of Respect. That is the real DNA of these broad left groups. Suppression of difference, not embracing of difference, and using a Marxist program as a framework for unity. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Excellent introduction. Very enjoyable. I think the 20%, we chose that title because the 20% tends to be about how we get there. Those are the 20%. It's the reformer revolution. What kind of, what is workers' control? What is the dictatorship of the proletariat, etc. But I can see how that could be. It's not a scientific correct title. Thanks very much, Marcus. Kat now is the next speaker. Kat is on the editorial board of Prometheus and speaking in a personal capacity. Thanks for joining us, Kat.
Thanks very much. I'm just logging on from my phone, so if it's a little bit clunky, just let me know. Yeah, thank you very much. Marcus, I think, covered really well the arguments around the operation of revolutionaries within these organisations, and often why they're actually the ones arguing for and working to set up these organisations in the first place. I mean, I will just kind of preface it before we go into it a little bit deeper, but obviously there is a big difference between arguing to set up these types of organisations and arguing to, and working to lay the basis of and arguing that these are the organisations we need. There's a difference between that and then if these organisations emerge, the question of should we get involved or should we intervene in them? And I would argue, yes, we intervene in them when they emerge, but that's a very different question from being the ones who are setting them up or arguing that they are what we need right now. And I think that's obviously the argument that needs tackling amongst revolutionaries, who are the ones often initiating these projects and putting forward the arguments that that's what we need in this period. So I think Marcus has really clearly laid out the thinking behind revolutionaries who put forward those arguments and sort of unpacking that. So what I kind of wanted to look at, I suppose, just thinking about the title of the meeting and why broad fronts like collective and so on, why they will keep on failing. And I guess I wanted to think about failing for who. So obviously they're made up of different parts. And Marx has talked a lot about the revolutionary component of that. I guess it's useful to try and unpick some of the other trends within that and how we might also address our arguments to them. So when we think about if something is failing, we have to ask, I suppose, what exactly a force is trying to achieve out of this. So it tells us about the measures of success, what it is that different trends are trying to achieve, and what they might be failing at through this. Because obviously, as Marcus has outlined, some revolutionaries, for example, they might be arguing for these broad front parties, but they'll have their own strategy that is separate from that. They're trying to achieve something else through that process. So this involves assessing what are the different trends involved in setting up these projects and what are they trying to achieve through them. So when we look at broad fronts, or those who tend to get involved in broad fronts, there are different trends that are involved in organising and advocating for building these organisations. But ultimately, they might have different visions about what the purposes of these organisations are, what they're capable of, and what they're able to achieve. So there's those that we might describe as social democratic in their overall perspective. There's also those we might describe as democratic socialist, and I think that's something that has strongly emerged as a kind of popular trend, particularly in the UK around Corbynism and during that post-Corbyn period, trying to assess some of the failures there. And then finally, as Marcus has covered a lot, and who I imagine are represented in the audience here, those who we would see as revolutionary. And obviously that's kind of what would group all of us together, but some of us will have different perspective within that on broad fronts. So I'll address each of them and go through the kind of arguments that I think are useful to direct there. So firstly, there are those whose politics are social democratic. So what we might mean by that is having a project of reforming capitalism, but who recognise the manner in which the Labour Party has been captured and want to organise a new party broadly along those lines. So what we might call a Labour Party Mark II when it's being discussed around this. I would say they represent the trend whose politics are probably most honestly and straightforwardly expressed in these organisations. And I suppose that in a lot of ways that's a criticism towards the other trends, because the social democratic trend, they want what the broad front party says on the tin, and they believe it to be achievable through it. So they represent that trend that does believe that the kind of reformist programme of a broad party is achievable, and that this expresses the goal that they want to organise around. So essentially a working class party organised around broadly left-wing positions, able to advance values of equality, opposition to the excesses of capitalism, to fight against the rollback of the welfare state, and to push for something like a return to the post-war settlement, a return to the period of the welfare state from 1945 to the late 1970s. Some within it will argue for more than that, pushing further from that, but essentially arguing for a kind of state intervention to build up and support services to meet people's needs, and using redistribution of resources from the top to the bottom as a tool to enable this. This is also the trend which other forces, the democratic socialists and the revolutionaries, pitch towards to try and get on board within these broad fronts. So that involves maybe softening our own politics to do so, as Marcus described, on women's rights or on democratic demands. And often this is something that is preemptively done. So even before social democratic forces are on board, revolutionaries or others are arguing that we shouldn't be arguing for particular aspects of our politics because it's going to put off these potential people who will be coming along. So you might have initial, groups of revolutionaries coming together, with some revolutionaries telling other revolutionaries that we need to kind of keep our politics at bay. So just thinking back to, for example, organising in student campaigns where we'd put forward, in free education campaigns, and we'd put forward the, slogans to oppose tuition fees. And the SWP within that would say, oh no, this is going to put people off. We're against the we're against raising tuition fees. So even that kind of very limited demands, it wasn't others, social democratic forces in the student movement that were trying to kind of curtail political expression, but actually other revolutionaries within that. So it might be arguing to soften our politics, or trying to develop bureaucratic mechanisms to keep out the difficult and annoying revolutionary left forces. So things like, arrangements like in Tusk, where you'd have to be a kind of an organisation that signs up, not a membership organisation, not having the kind of means and tools to contest those politics and argue them out in the open. So the social democratic trend presents us with particular challenges, and obviously these aren't our politics, but they're important to engage with on the level. The argument that we're trying to win here is a different one by and large. So the argument we're trying to win with these forces is fundamentally that a revolutionary transformation of society itself is required. So we're not really having the argument with these forces about whether this organisation serves the best purposes to achieve our goals. We're actually, the argument here is around the goal that we're trying to advance. But part of the argument about the need for a revolutionary transformation of society is certainly strengthened by trying to present the case that such a social democratic Labour Party Mark II will face a fundamental problem in its stated task. So one of those obviously is the continued existence of the Labour Party, which continues to maintain the trade union link. But there's also more fundamentally the political economic critique, which suggests that the post-war settlement represents something more like an exception to the regular functioning of capitalism. It's a model dependent on inflationary wage increases to combat the kind of social depletion of the working class that was experienced in the 19th and early 20th century, and to stem that social unrest that was building. So this is something that capital was forced to accept for a given time, but obviously increasingly came to view as a burden that it had the potential to shake off through discipline in the working class, particularly with the fall of the counterweight that was represented in the Soviet Union. So instead, it pushed to a model of demand being sustained through mushrooming personal debt, a kind of privatized Keynesianism, and became reliant on a completely kind of different way of sustaining that demand. So what that critique suggests is that the conditions which made it beneficial for capital to accept the post-war settlement or force the post-war settlement onto capital, that those conditions don't exist anywhere near the same degree today. So the political task of forcing these concessions from capital becomes much more challenging, which means ultimately the space for such a social democratic project on its own terms can't be understood to exist in the same way that it did in the first half of the 20th century. So this in itself can be part of the argument in terms of winning people over to the idea that revolutionary transformation is necessary, that actually there might be limits in this period on what capital, what exactly we can kind of force capital into. So that space for the social democratic settlement has narrowed through this period, which makes their ultimate project less winnable in the immediate. But I suppose what I'm trying to say is that in terms of combating those social democratic trends and dealing with those social democratic trends, it's this argument that needs to be won first, the question of the ultimate goal, before we can meaningfully be on the same ground to discuss the purpose of the organisation itself and whether it meets the tasks in front of us. So that represents one of the trends. The next would be what we'd call the democratic socialist trend. And what I'll kind of present here picks up on themes that are developed in the Prometheus series we ran last year by Callum F. So he wrote 3 articles, sort of unpacking the strategy of democratic socialism in this period. And I think it was a really effective approach in trying to deal with it on its own terms, trying to deal with the arguments it puts forward. So this trend is represented in differing degrees by layers of the kind of groups and individuals who were drawn in around the carbon movement and through that kind of post-carbon period as well. So those around Momentum, Novara, the Tribune, in different ways, also those in for example, Notes from Below. A lot of the sort of key figures or individuals that we might identify with that that kind of organizing layer around carbonism. So a lot of it's influenced by thinkers like Leo Panitch, André Gortz, and Nicholas Poulantzas. This trend generally holds a vision of society that we might recognize in some ways. So it might share common ground in terms of ultimately what we're fighting for. In other words, the necessity of a fundamental transformation of the social system, the necessity of overcoming capitalism, and that this would involve or will involve, in some form at least, the power or action of the working class. And I think the idea of, in some form at least, the power or action of the working class, if we start to dig down a little bit into that, which I'll kind of go into, we can see some of those significant differences between what is espoused by the democratic socialists and what we as revolutionaries, particularly in arguing for that mass communist party, where we would see some of the fundamental differences. But on the surface, what differentiates this trend from revolutionary socialists is that they would pitch between reformism and revolution, or they would argue for the overcoming of the dichotomy between them. They would argue that through struggle, which might on the surface appear kind of ostensibly reformist, But if we take the correct strategy in that, then more fundamental and significant changes can be precipitated if this pushes at key aspects of the capitalist system, or if this strengthens and polarizes the working class from the capitalist system in particular ways. This approach is made up of various strategies that, from my perspective, I think are often quite opaque in how they're presented and communicated to others, particularly in the wider movement. So I would say that these are strategies that have clearly informed some of these groups and layers, some of these individuals, but the level of knowledge about this within the wider movement is extremely low, I think. So there's a kind of disconnect between this layer of people working from these quite well-developed strategies and then the degree to which that is communicated and known by the movement that they're trying to organise. So these strategies are encompassed in an idea of counter-attack socialism that involves strategies like pushing for non-reformist reforms. So this is arguing that there's particular reforms that push at the logic of the system. So it's, you know, not a million miles away, maybe, and this would be a critique. It's certainly not something that I think these people would identify themselves, but it's not a million miles away from some of the articulations of transitional demands, that there might be particular reformist or particular reforms that we could push for and argue for that themselves start to chip away at the logic of the system. So they start to escalate or catalyze wider struggle and wider challenge to the system. Also the idea of being in and against the state, which kind of it builds on ideas that grew up in the 70s from people like social workers who were, you know, practicing as radical social workers and trying to find a way to articulate their position as being, you know, part of the state infrastructure, but also opposed to and opposing that. So trying to think about how you know, this broad party might be able to get positions and representation in local government or more widely, and how that can itself be used and mobilized to push against and build power against the state in some ways. And also the idea of class struggle elections, that there might be ways of intervening in elections and presenting particular issues and particular demands that might polarize the working class against the system in important ways. So that's just a very brief summary of some of the strategies that are kind of taken on clearly by these layers. The idea from this perspective is that these strategies could be pursued then and achieved through a broad party rather than an openly revolutionary party. So in other words, a party organised on a social democratic basis, but which through the pursuit of these strategies may push for more advanced goals. So here the broad party organisation appropriately reflects the form in which democratic socialists would envisage their strategy taking shape, even if that strategy itself is one which goes beyond the kind of social democratic basis that the party is on paper standing for. The result of this, I think, you know, obviously would argue is quite damning in a lot of ways, and we can see some of that as was played out through Corbynism and through Momentum, that a particular kind of layer of organisers or strategists are able to kind of push forward the direction of the movement, but then that can quickly fall apart because there's no real base or development or understanding of the strategy here. It's being engineered through groups that might be quite opaque and impenetrable to the wider movement itself. So the starts to appear a disconnect between groups, often affinity type groups of strategists and organisers that form a sort of separate layer from the party as a whole, from the organisation as a whole. They become a layer that see themselves as developing and enacting strategy, but it's not always known to or clear to the party or the movement itself, which can sort of be pulled in different directions through this without fully understanding or sharing the objectives of this strategy. This approach is, I think, again, in a Prometheus article by Harry Holmes, is again scrutinised very effectively. So he criticises this as what he calls the network left. These networks, these affinity groups, who see strategy as being something that's developed by, this kind of these networks and this smaller minority of people, and it's then enacted onto the wider party or onto the wider movement. I think this is ultimately a question of how we understand the political agency of the working class, what we understand by working class self-organisation and revolutionary transformation itself as being the conscious act of the working class. This strategy involved in and bound up with democratic socialism, I think ultimately fails to conceive of the advanced section of the working class as itself being the one that develops and forms strategy, that it has an active and open role in the development of strategy. And for those of us who argue for a mass communist party, that's precisely the sphere that allows that to take shape. The mass communist party is seen, from our perspective, as being the space and the tool in which the advanced section of the working class is able to thrash out, is able to use all of its knowledge, all of its experience to refine, develop and produce the highest form that we can from our experiences. What the strategies involved, I think, in counter-attack socialism and the democratic socialists, where they fall down, I think, is that they don't ultimately open up this space for the working class to play that role in its own self-emancipation, in its own self-organization, that faith that this, that we can have a party that itself is the open space for the development of strategy, that's clearly and transparently communicated to all, that we lend that kind of serious faith that people will be able to understand and will be able to openly organize around the strategies and develop the strategies that represent that kind of highest form, rather than it being this almost professionalized layer that develop strategy and organize the wider movement. So I think the critiques again here that we present of the democratic socialist trend, we need to to do this effectively, we need to critique it on its own terms, to deal with the arguments and the strategy that it puts forward, which I think the articles from Callum do very effectively. We try to address it to the level at which it's pitched itself. I think actually, maybe being optimistic, but I think that this is actually quite a winnable argument with a lot of these layers, or certainly with the people who have been pulled in around these layers. I think it's a winnable argument if we find ways to make it well, if we deal with it on its own terms and we pose those clear and focused criticisms towards those trends. Because ultimately what we're counterposing to that is the idea that the working class itself should play the active role in developing strategy, that it itself, through experience and through political learning and understanding and development of consciousness, can take that active role, that it's not simply this force to be pushed at and manipulated in different ways, which again, bears significant similarities with some of the critiques that we might present of sections of the Trotskyist left in their application of the transitional method. So that's kind of most of what I wanted to outline in terms of how we have to kind of pitch and develop our criticisms and arguments around the broad front and the broad party as a model of organisation, that we have to be able to assess which trends are present in these arguments and upon what basis, you know, when we try to critique broad fronts as being you know, as being failures or not achieving the goals, we have to, I suppose, unpack exactly what are the goals that they're trying to achieve through that. Obviously, finally, the trend, which, you know, we would probably all fall into ourselves, would be revolutionaries. And when revolutionaries are working within, arguing and organising for the broad front model, this looks like something certainly different to the social democratic trend, because it's got a very different ultimate goal, but also looks different to the democratic socialist trend, because although the ultimate goal or objective might look something similar, the broad front organisation isn't actually conceived as being the vehicle that can advance that. It's instead a means by which to advance other objectives and other organisational forms. And I think that this is certainly where we should direct the strongest of our criticism, because a lot of this takes, you know, almost cynical forms in the level to which our own politics are hidden away, and what this presents and what this says about Marxists and revolutionaries in the movement as a whole, that we can just put on different hats. We'll be involved in this campaign and that campaign, this broad party and what have you, and we hide away our own identity, that Marxism isn't something that belongs to the working class as a kind of possession of its own, but something that should be held away by a quite tightly knit revolutionary organisation. And obviously in its kind of worst forms, it appears simply as a means of recruitment or the building of a small trend within this. I think Marcus, really covered quite well the thinking and the critiques that we need to present around that. So I won't say much more, but obviously just really to emphasize that we need to counterpose and advance the idea of a mass communist party as being our organisational form and the one which we must openly fight for. That we see it as the long-term building of the mass political consciousness and organisational power of the working class. So yeah, be interested to hear people's thoughts around it. I do think it is quite important to differentiate the trends and to direct our specific arguments in different ways to them. I think, particularly around the democratic socialist trend, I think if we sort of familiarise ourselves with the arguments that they're putting forward and we directly take them on the questions of working class self-organisation and the role that has in the development of strategy, I actually think we can gain a lot of ground and win a lot of arguments on that. Some of the others potentially more challenging, but equally as important. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Kat. Can I just ask you on that last point then? The democratic socialist trend, do they actually try to set up broad fronts? I mean, are Novora and these lot, or do you mean Momentum as a broad front? Because Novora is not involved in anything, are they?
Yeah, I think it's really about what they would argue for. So if you look at sort of the arguments that are put forward by key people involved in Novara Media, they would be arguing for these type of broad front organisations. And I think some of, we can see to a degree some of it in the article that Joe Todd wrote, and obviously he's sort of involved with those layers, arguing for that kind of broader organisation that encompasses and is organised on the basis of everybody identifying as socialist or everybody identifying as left, that we can kind of group them together on that basis and then work out the political basis of our organisation from there. So I think obviously there's there's people who are actively trying to set things up, but then there's also those kind of wider layers who put those arguments forward. So, for example, the Tribune again is a media outlet, but put forward certainly those arguments from Leo Panitch, etc., around non-reformist reforms.
It seems to me that the collective party, which might or not might come into being, is almost like a crossover of the democratic socialist trend and the revolutionary socialist trend. We've just learned the SWP tried to join collective, but was told to get lost. And so they've set up a broad front called We Demand Change in order to be able to be allowed to join the other broad front, which is collective, which is sort of run by Pamela Fitzpatrick and Kerry Murphy, with or without Corbyn, perhaps. But just talking about, I mean, the subject of the title, and I should say, comrades, if you want to come in, ask a question, make a contribution, please click raise hand. But you know, the point of this discussion, as was last week's, is of course not to just say, oh, they're all crap, you know, none of this will work. I mean, we understand we're a tiny minority at the moment, the revolutionary socialists. We're nothing. We're tiny groups. And that's why, I mean, it is important, isn't it, to try and win over the right. I mean, we want to win them to our politics. And there are occasions where we could have partial unity with some of the more right-wing forces of the movement, because we do understand we're not the majority. In order to change things, we need to become the majority, etc. But you know, I mean, how do we understand that these are, what is it that makes them fail, these broad fronts? I mean, we've touched on various of their problems, but is it, Marcus, maybe to you first now, is it the contradictions between the revolutionary program of your own, you know, the actual revolution program, and then what you're fighting for? Are these contradictions playing out too much? What kind of pressures usually lead to these failing? And I quite understand what Kat said. We have to understand actually on their own terms, you know, did they fail or maybe they didn't fail? You know, how do we think they fail? How did Socialist Alliance fail and Respect failed?
Well, I mean, Socialist Alliance failed because the SWP pulled out and created Respect, which then failed. So I think probably part of the problem is that these broad left groups who are morally repulsed for good reasons by the extreme right wing of existing social democracy in the form, I don't know if you can call Keir Starmer a social democrat. He's a he's just an imperialist, really. He's not even a social imperialist. But the space is occupied. I mean, I'm a member of the Labor Party in Australia. If you want to be in a mass organisation where people have illusions that you can change capitalism and improve it bit by bit, those organisations exist in most countries. So it's basically trying to create a nice version of something that already exists on a mass scale. I saw Steve Freeman is in the meeting, and I was stunned by his comment. I can't remember, it may have been last week or 2 weeks ago, where he said, "Oh, there are tens of thousands of people who have these ideas." No, there's more than 10. There's millions of people who have these ideas. It is a common idea in the working class that if you vote for the Labor Party, you know, maybe it's a bit bad at the moment, but eventually we'll get decent change, and they're our bastards, not their bastards. So if you want a mass, and again, I think Kat's hit on something, that also these programs of unity around reformism or left, they are about returning to the past. They're about reconstituting the post-World War II consensus of the welfare state. So, you know, I think the idea, and Trump is leaving all this in the dust. I mean, a lot of the Palestine movement is left with defend international law. And I mean, wow, the history is leaving these people behind. So I think they fail because they look to the past, they suppress difference, And also they're trying to recreate social democracy, reformism. And in most places, these manifestations exist at a mass scale, albeit to the right, because that's where bourgeois society is, to the right.
And it seems to be, I mean, it seems to be an attempt really as a shortcut, isn't it? I mean, you've been peddling your, we're saying we need revolution and here's our program. And people are not coming, are they? They're not storming the gates at the moment to join our communist organizations. So it's an attempt, I suspect, as a shortcut to the masses, isn't it? I mean, it's not necessarily a bad thing, isn't it? We want to reach the masses. The question is, how do we reach them without subordinating ourselves to a right that sometimes isn't even there, as Marcus said. What do you think on that, Kat?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, again, I think, and you could sort of see that with how things played out with Transform when it was just kind of getting going. A lot of the, I suppose, it's not easy being so isolated and in such a kind of a minority, putting forward arguments that quite clearly are not held by society in general. That's a challenging and difficult position to be in, and I think sometimes it feels safer and easier to think, oh well, look at these polls that show 60% of people want the railways nationalised or whatever it might be. So these figures show us, and a lot of the, with the democratic socialist stuff, there is a lot of the data shows us this, and the focus groups show us that, and that kind of maybe reliance on that sort of research culture to understand politics. But yeah, you could certainly see with Transform this idea that, okay, well, if we just sort of present this basis that we've seen people agree with in society, then surely loads of people are going to come to us. So that's sort of maybe worth the sacrifice of softening and minimizing our politics. But then obviously what we see in practice is that doesn't happen, that actually the numbers that are collected together around those organizations is not so much significantly more than the revolutionary left itself. So in terms of that kind of, I suppose, idea of failure and what's leading to it, it's that hope that people have that by softening our politics we might be able to spread out and mushroom quickly. It doesn't play out in reality, where it's able to grow in terms of groups like Respect. It's often built on extremely shaky coalitions that quite easily fall apart because there isn't that sort of commitment to developing a clear political basis for them. So I understand, I suppose, the impulse of people going towards these organizations, but eventually that doesn't play out in practice, and I think obviously leads to disillusionment and dropping away, and it just seems to, at least at the moment, being repeated on a cycle extremely quickly with a series of different organizations.
Yeah, especially, because we had hundreds of thousands of people joining the Labour Party under Corbyn. We must be able to recreate that if we just copy his politics, and it's not happening, is it? It doesn't work like that. Corbyn was particularly, he was close to power, wasn't he? That's what his magic dust was. He could actually have implemented some of these things, whereas most of the groups today have no chance of that. Okay, I'll bring in some comrades from the floor now, and it'd be good to have a conversation with you two answering those. Ian, hi.
Good evening, comrades. Just a couple of small points, really. Question is as to why parties that we might regard as revolutionary parties have been so unsuccessful. And my own feeling about it is what we've been up against is precisely the broad, the consistent failure of broad left organisations of social democracy as a whole, and the fact that has been passed off as socialism for so very long. in terms of the minimum program, but very few people actually talk about the maximum program. Very few people actually talk about what communism would actually be. And I think that's one of the most important features of what a revolutionary communist party should do. I think there's no doubt, in my mind at least, that capitalism is in decline. Whether it's in a sort of state of terminal decline and whether it's going to implode tomorrow, I think is questionable. At the moment, this is, as has been become almost cliche to say, more imaginable to think of the end of the world than it is to think of the end of capitalism. But we've reached a point where there's absolutely no choice. The question is why that doesn't bring people flocking in. It does seem to be some glimmers of hope in terms of people quite clearly are rejecting everywhere what might have been regarded as the mainstream reformist politics of the last even 100 years, you could say. As we understand, both Stalinism and social democracy have been significant impediments to the development of any kind of communist ideas. And where communists do theory, whilst it's of course vitally important that we focus on our history and learning from our history, it seems frequently that when communists do theory, it's mostly to talk about dead Bolsheviks rather than concentrate on the actual contemporary political economy of a declining capitalism. I don't believe out there that there aren't people with a good brain that can work on an understanding of the present as a guide to our revolutionary activity in the future. If you actually put it to people what communism is, and you don't use the words, for example, and you just were to pose it as a series of possibilities, nobody would actually be opposed to the idea of, an absolute minimal working week of necessary labour in exchange for being able to develop yourself in any way you please. No one would be actually opposed to the idea that you could virtually abolish money very quickly. I mean, we're moving in that direction now. A cashless society is a real possibility, and it doesn't take too much imagination to work out how you could move to a completely moneyless society in favour of, as opposed to kind of notions around labour certificates or all these old things from the past. But I think communism is increasingly imaginable. What people don't seem to have is a belief that it's at least possible, either because of notions around human nature or because of it would be such a bloodbath that it wouldn't be worth the effort. But the problem is, of course, it's already a bloodbath, and it's already an existential crisis for the whole of humanity. So, as I say, in a sense, we have absolutely no choice. The failure of Stalinism doesn't seem to stop people being wistfully Stalinist, which I find quite an extraordinary phenomenon. But whether that's just a kind of a wistful longing for a movement of some sort or other, but the other aspect of it is a wistful yearning for the social democracy of the past, which I find inexplicable. For people who want to make an argument for social housing, I agree. But for a lot of people, their experience, like mine, was council housing was the opportunity for the council to tyrannize over your life, or being, providing utterly wretched housing, rather than it being something that was designed by people on a democratic basis to meet human need, as everything would be in a communist society. And then the other thing is, and probably the most important thing, is the question around democracy. And from my point of view, the appeal of the council communist perspective, for example, was the idea that it would be the working class in charge and not the central committee of the party. And I think that's an important thing for us always to remember. And so therefore, what I'm going to argue for time and time again is really, let's not forget the maximum program, and let's talk about the maximum program to workers, because I think the idea of capitalism as having a prolonged appeal will soon be challenged by climate change and war and destruction on a scale that hasn't been seen for a very long time. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Also think we should consider that what we are doing is we're in a period of preparation, aren't we? Unless the working class moves, there can't be a majority revolution. But that we, the communists, have to be ready for that moment when it does start to move and getting our house in order, etc. I suggest I take one more speaker and then you two can come back and then we take another round if that's agreeable. Okay, William, hi. You're muted.
I'm unmuted. Muted, I am. Well, I think a lot of our national histories have a bearing on this. And I don't think you have a radical history in Britain. I think you have a reformist history. You went for reform and you boast about being the mother of parliaments and all that silly nonsense. And yet you have a monarchy. So you certainly don't have a radical tradition. Now, in Ireland, we have a radical tradition, but we don't have a revolutionary tradition, which is something different. Like, we will rebel, but we won't construct a party of the people. Now, there was attempts to create a communist party in Ireland in the 1920s and 1921. You had two very, very good writers, Tom and O'Flaherty, Liam and Thomas O'Flaherty, two brothers from the Aran Islands, started a communist party with James Connolly's son Rory. Now that was sabotaged by the British Communist Party, and it took 60 years for that to come out. What happened was the Comintern at the time sent directions via London to what was to happen in Ireland, what they wished to happen in Ireland. And the British Party, being jingoistic and chauvinist on bits as they were, altered that and told the Irish Party to dissolve. And they did dissolve. So we never had a Communist Party. The original one was never founded. Now, the Communist Party of Britain at the time expelled all the anti-imperialist people, including Sylvia Pankhurst. She was expelled. So was other people like the chap in Scotland. He was expelled. I think he was never the minute, but he was a very excellent socialist. He was expelled. And let's just face your history and just don't face your history. Like, I remember when I was in the official Republican movement and I had to go offside and I went back to Birmingham where I was brought up and I hid for a few months so the police wouldn't get me. I was asked to go to the Militant Tendencies annual conference, which was being held in Birmingham. I didn't want to go, and I said I wasn't going, and then I was told, okay, somebody else will be sent, and I said, oh no, hold on, I will go, so, because I wasn't having anyone else contaminated by that level. And when I got there, I was given a minder, and the first thing he says to me, how is it going, Pat? I said, let's get something straight here. My name is not Pat, it's Bill. Oh, sorry about that, Bill. Didn't realise you were a Protestant. Now, what kind of mentality and knowledge had he got of Ireland? None. So, if you just want to create your party, and the best luck to you if you can do it, but personally, I don't think you have an earthly hope in hell of creating any party. because you haven't got the material to make a party in the first place. I always don't want to hear that, but too bad. As we said.
It's your view. You can say it. I think we've had plenty of revolutionary potential in this country, for example, the Chartists. But anyway,
they were Irish, by the way. The Chartists were Irish.
some.
Yeah. Any radical movement ever had, it was the Irish that done it. Fergus O'Connor was Irish.
Okay. Okay, sorry, I have to mute you now, comrade. Marcus and Kat, do you want to respond to something, or should we take some more speakers?
Well, I've had a pop at Steve Freeman, so he's next in line. Maybe let him come back before we do.
Okay. Is that okay, Kat? Okay, Steve, off you go.
Yeah, hit me with a real one there, Marcus. When I said I think it was 100,000 people, and you said it was million. So I could be corrected on that. I've not counted them numbers up that well. But anyway, let's just come back. So I would consider myself to be a Republican communist, and therefore I'd start where Marcus started, when Marcus told us about Lenin in State and Revolution, talking about the centrality of the Democratic Republic. That's a great starting point, but let's start from the opposite end. Communism is made possible by capitalism, and the world is ready objectively for communism on a world scale. So there's a massive problem if it's objectively ready, when subjectively people are not ready for that. But we can't get to communism, I would argue, without an international socialist revolution. But we can't get to an international socialist revolution unless the working class comes to power in at least one country to start off with, to trigger, as it did in Russia in 1917. And we can't get to workers' power, as we did in Russia in 1917, without democratic revolution. So we need to be a democratic revolution. And we can't get to democratic revolution, or I get back to where Marcus was. Democratic republics, the key to all of that. So there we've got going from one end backwards or forwards: democratic revolution, democratic republic, democratic revolution, workers' power, international socialist revolution, world communism. So that has to be where we base ourselves. And the problem that we've got is that a mass party is possible in Britain today. I do believe that, but a mass communist party is not. And that's because of the objective conditions are not right for it. The objective conditions for communism are, but the subjective consciousness of the people, which is what William, I think, was saying to us a minute or two ago. And we can't overcome that by pure voluntarism, by the effort of will, by trying harder, by, let's say, have a daily worker instead of a weekly worker. Maybe that will get the whole show on the road. We can't, because the conditions are not particularly right for that. So it takes us back to the question, I think, of the relationship between the communists and the social democrats. Because social democratic workers is the majority. Did you say millions, Marcus, or tens of thousands? I can't really remember. And therefore, we do have to go, as Marcus did, back to the experience that we had in the Socialist Alliance and all the rest of it, that we were there. That's the real experience. First of all, you better make a distinction between 2008 and what happened before 2008. The first round was after 1997 or 1996, when Tony Blair, New Labour, took power with neoliberalism. And with the marginalisation of the Labour left, the old Labour left, the attempt was to set up social monarchists. I could rather call them social monarchists than social Democrats, by the way, because they're based on 1945 settlement of a constitutional monarchy and a welfare state. I call that the social monarchy. So we had a social monarchy from 1945. So all these parties, Socialist Labour Party, Socialist Alliance, Respect Us, Left Unity, all had a programme of social monarchism, that is to restore the thing to 1945. And that then failed. It failed when after the 2008 banking crisis, and then with austerity, then suddenly Corbyn turns up. What programme does Corbyn turn up with? He turns up with a social monarchist programme of 1945 again. This time everybody gathers around it after 2015. They're still trying, if you look at the manifestos of 2017, 2019, it's all about rebuilding the social monarchy. So why did these parties fail? Well, we can say they could simply say, well, they were reformists, so they could fail. No, I think it's much more deeper than that. They failed because the communists didn't fight for republicanism within those formations. That's my charge. The only way they could have succeeded is on the basis of them having a Republican program to unite around, and they didn't have that. Because our social and constitutional monarchy is in the deepest crisis it's ever been. And therefore, trying to resurrect the 1945 social monarchy is objectively a failure. The whole system is in a state of absolute degeneration. So if you want to come back and try it all again in a system that's failing, that's not going to work. And so, should social democratic workers and communist workers unite in a single party? Yes, of course they should if they can. Why? Because it'd be more effective to fight together against a common enemy than to fight each other all the time. So that's the real reason for it. We can be more effective with if it's a million, Marcus, or tens of thousands, I don't know whatever the number is, and the communists are a minority in that. That would be a way forward. The problem is the communist movement. I'll finish on this point, Tina, but the communist movement is split into three ways, I would argue. One is the Stalinists, the remnants of the Stalinists from the Communist Party of Great Britain and the Communist Party of Britain. Then you've got the Trotskyist movement, the second. You've got the SWP, well, the WRP has gone militant socialist party. And then there ought to be a Republican communist minority. Well, where is that minority? Who's in that minority? Where are they? That's what they need. We need to be able to fight, I would argue, together against the Stalinists and Trotskyists. We need to wage a war against them because the Stalinists and Trotskyists are a barrier to the creating the kind of communist party that we need. The idea we should all get together in one big blob, no, that won't work. They have to be taken on. I just want to take up one final point with Kat. One of the things that she said. She made a distinction between setting up one of these parties and joining it once it was set up. This is wrong, completely wrong. And I'll tell you why. It's okay to say, well, it's set up, we can go along and join it. It's like being the rear guard. If you're going to be the vanguard, you need to be in at the beginning shaping what happens. The rear guard, the tail end Charlies, the people who sat at the back of the Lancaster bombers, the tail end Charlies, when the whole thing was going, they were sitting at the back and being shot at. You need to be at the front. You need to shape the kind of party and not leave it to the Social Democrats to decide the kind of program they have and the communists to be absent at the beginning of the process. So if the communists are going to be a vanguard, they need to be in there, if there's going to be such a party, fighting to shape it from the word go and not turning up when everything has been decided. I'll finish there.
Thanks, Steve. Marcus first.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad Steve came in there. I mean, Steve, again, his great plan is to make sure that communists are in a minority in a mass workers' party. I actually want communists to be in a majority in a mass workers' party, not a minority. And I think that should be our approach. Again, what Steve has in common with John Rees, Chris Nineham, the Pabloites, the Mandelites, is that by being in a minority, we manipulate history. Unprincipled coalitions based on this idea of great men in history, that we become the levers of power, working history in our favor. And we saw that with the Fisk group in the SLP, thinking they could manipulate Arthur Scargill. We saw it in Respect with John Rees thinking he could sort of ride George Galloway to mass politics. And you just at some point you reveal yourself as the man behind the curtain. I mean, this is just this is not a pathway to mass politics. And I think what is at essence of it is this idea that Marxist politics are irrelevant to today's world, that we need some sort of pretend politics before we reveal our real program. Well, if that's the case, then we're irrelevant completely. I mean, there's no point unless our minimum program, and which is tied, as Ian has said, to our maximum program for a world without war, without environmental catastrophe, without class oppression, without racial and sexual oppression. our minimum program is for a republic, yes, but what does the republic do? Just bring in well 1945 without the Queen, Steve. I mean, that seems to be what you're saying. That again, you just fight to be a minority. I mean, Steve, you already are. You don't have to fight. So what we need to do is we need to bring back the centrality of program, that our minimum program, our republicanism, our mass democracy is relevant to today as a bridge towards the sort of society we want. It is not that complex an idea. But for most of the far left, as Steve has pointed out, and Ian and others, democracy is absent from their program in reality. They see themselves as putschists or coupists or a minority, as Steve wants to be. They want to be a minority that manipulates history rather than the mass majority that then rules society, which is at the core of republicanism, Steve. You should know. This idea that I think that the central to the idea as well is we need to be building two parties at the same time. Reread Chris Nineham in Prometheus. That's what he argues. We need two parties. We need this blob party, which we fish in, and we show people we're really good. We're really good at, organizing the next demo. Therefore, you should join the secret Marxist group at the heart of this process, or the Republican Communist heart, or whatever. Replace it with whatever secret society you're running, Steve. But of course, you've got the reality is this crisis within reformism, which does exist because of the crisis of capitalism, is finding an expression at the opinion polls in Britain. I was just looking at John Rees's Facebook thread that he's saying, "Oh, Starmer is toast. 2 more by-elections and where reform wins, and he's gone." And that the anti-war movement is central here. The political expression that this is around the question of should British troops go to Ukraine. The majority of people are saying no, but the big recipient of this is the Reform Party. It's Farage. It's the far right. It's not the anti-war left. It's not the socialist left. It's not the Marxist left. And that is because there's an absolute absence of unity and of audacity of political program on the left. And I mean, Bill, of course, there is a radical tradition in England which is suppressed. I mean, England did manage to chop the head off its king at some point, which I think is a pretty radical thing to do. And there's the Diggers, there's the Commonwealth, there's the Chartists. I mean, I think, yes, there is a conservative trend in the working class in England, but there is in Ireland as well. There is in Australia. There is conservative trends everywhere. And I think that we need to reach into actually, I think one of the good things John Rees is doing at the moment is reaching into that radical history of the English, which I think is something we should do as well and make it part of our tradition. But I think at heart, we aren't about building two parties at the same time. We should be building one party around a Marxist program. We should be doing that in the existing reformist organisations, in the Labor Party, not creating fictitious new ones to have, fantasy fishing expeditions to build the true party at the heart of it all, which is what Steve's program shares with Chris Nineham, shares with the Pabloites, shares with all these sect groups.
Thank you, Marcus. Just before I bring in Kat, just on that, we've had loads of sessions, of course, on exactly that working class history, most of them delivered by Kevin Bean, who sadly died last year. But we've launched the Kevin Bean Library, kevinbeanlibrary.com, where many of his sessions on the Diggers, on the English Civil War, etc., are to be found. So I'd recommend comrades have a look there. Kat.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I definitely appreciated Ian's points around the maximum programme. And I think that he's right that actually the arguments of social democracy, and certainly what people have seen play out through the Labour Party and with ideas around reformism in general, I think that that's correct, that there is massive disillusionment with that. There's disillusionment with the idea that capitalism actually will be able to produce anything better for us than what we have right now, and actually that there is a widespread belief that it will only give us worse over time. So I think that, obviously it's anecdotally, but, from my own experience and kind of going door knocking as well through the election, certainly I would see that kind of disillusionment as being quite widespread. A lot of people vote Labour, but with no hope or hope or faith involved in that. So the arguments that we have to put forward around the maximum programme and also around the means by which that can actually be achieved through working class power, through the Democratic Republic, actually that's a significant and important part of exactly what we need to be doing. And actually there's reason to believe that can have more purchase now than it might have done in previous times when capitalism has been able to show itself to be able to give us more in certain circumstances. But and this is quite a, I suppose, simple or basic point, but if nobody is out there actually making these arguments, nobody is out there actually arguing openly these communist politics, then it's unclear to us actually how much purchase that will have with people. If we're always softening our politics when we are in public, in the movement, in a campaign, if we always put on a different hat and try and keep our revolutionary politics to the back room, then who is there out there who is actually presenting this different conception of society, this idea of the social transformation that is necessary? There is widespread disillusionment around reformism and around what capitalism can deliver to us, but there's no kind of vision that is being put forward in the place of that. So I do think that, I agree with Steve's argument. We can't voluntaristically just with a little bit more effort completely transform the nature of working class consciousness in this period, but that doesn't mean that we don't have opportunity, and that doesn't mean that we don't have inroads to try and build and develop a core of that consciousness, so that when objective circumstances develop or change, that we have a much better footing to be able to advance that. And I see that opportunity in the disillusionment, and I see our failure to respond in any meaningful way to that disillusionment with a clear vision of what might look different to that, and what kind of transformation is possible. On Steve's points, he said it's better to be united against the common enemy, united with social democrats against the common enemy. But I suppose I would say, is there actually agreement or recognition of who that common enemy is? As communists, we would say the common enemy is the capitalist system itself and the impulse that it puts upon us to discipline our life in such a way, and that affects us throughout society as a whole. It's a problem of the system itself. Whereas if we look at social democrats, often it's bad individuals or greedy individuals or certain sections of capital, finance capital, that might behave in particular ways, and if we could just rein those in, then we could as a sort of a nation made up of different classes, we could come together around our own kind of shared society and try and bring down levels of inequality. And I think that those are the kind of issues, and I think that Steve was absolutely right to say that consciousness is the fundamental question. But when we enter into these, or when we seek to enter into these broad organisations, and we say, yes, we've got the same common enemy here, we pull back our own politics here, and that impacts on consciousness, not simply because nobody's there advancing those arguments about the real kind of systemic level of transformation that's required, but when we say, yes, the enemy is finance capital, or yes, the enemy is greedy bankers, that has a damaging effect on consciousness itself, because it gives us a different set of tasks in front of us. It gives us a different conception of the type of transformation in society that is required. So I absolutely agree that consciousness is the fundamental question, but that means that we need to take seriously, even on a super isolated, small scale, take seriously the behavior that we have within organizations, our approach to organizations, what we advocate within them, because that does have an impact on consciousness, even on a small scale. And if we envision ourselves being able to build anything bigger than what we have, then yeah. So I'd apply the same question to why we don't argue to set these things up, but we do intervene in them, because if we're going around arguing to set them up, we're saying that that's what's required. And again, that damages political consciousness.
Sorry to rush you along there. We've got about 20 minutes. We've got still 3 people who want to speak. Also quickly wanted to answer a question by John in the chat. In terms of program, you know, how can we have these discussions about Communist Party if we haven't sorted out the program? We are accompanying the fusion process, but we're not it. So we are an education discussion series around it. There's other 3 organizations who are involved in this, and they are discussing concretely what kind of program they're having, and that probably will become part of our education series further down the line. But for the moment, that's happening elsewhere. But it is, of course, of crucial importance. Matthew first, and if I could ask comrades to keep it succinct, please. Thank you.
I'll get to the point where I have to be succinct, right? No, I mean, I think the problem is there's an intersection of a number of things here, I think. You know, I mean, the thing is, if you look at the actual nature of reformist parties at the moment, of course, as they've been reduced to husks. You know, the Labour Party, of course, in this country has barely any members. The right wing like it like that. They don't want mass membership. Because it makes it much easier for them to control it. That's just why when Corbynism meant you know, the increase in membership, you know, I mean, obviously if you look at the whole piece with you know, the Labour Party, I mean, membership has been declining, certainly, you know, for many decades. And whenever, you know, Corbyn managed to increase the membership, which I think is a different thing. Of course, the first thing they wanted to do was get rid of people. I mean, they actually said it, you know, why do we want all these people in this organisation? You know, we want rid of them. You know, we want to expel 200,000 people or get, you know, force them out, which is largely what they've done. You know, I mean, if you look at it in those terms, I mean, what we're seeing, of course, is the working class itself. Not only is the political parties been reduced to that. Of course, so have the unions. The union have been reduced to husks in many cases, you know, and so is the faith in bourgeois democracy. I mean, if you look at it, you know, somewhere like here in Glasgow, I mean, when they first instituted universal suffrage, there was in excess of 80% of people voted, something approaching 90% of people voted. Because obviously they thought, you know, that having managed to struggle and get this, that it was going to make a difference. And now, of course, I mean, less than half the people in the city now vote, because they understand, obviously, that in their guts, you know, this is not some great revolutionary thing, but they understand, of course, it doesn't make voting for these bastards doesn't make a great lot of difference. You know, unless you've got some people who actually, you know, actually will exploit the system and use bourgeois democracy, you know, other than for their own gain or promulgating the system, which is what happens. The other problem you've got, actually, of course, is the nature of the left. I mean, the sects, of course, they don't have internal democracy themselves. They don't actually learn anything, or particularly, and they have operated in a degenerate way, and you can see they're all basically fractionating every time there's an argument. people get flung out. You know, as we've seen it, say for the, you know, you can take this from the likes of the SWP who've fractionated in God knows how many different directions. People have been flung out, John Rees and Richard Seymour and all these other groups. I mean, there's probably a dozen groups been thrown out of the SWP in the last 20 years. And you can say the same for the militant. I mean, you know, militants now fractionated into about at least half a dozen or more groups. You know, basically every time there's an argument, people get flung out or leave. So there's not a political process there. You've also got a political degeneration of the left. I mean, the interesting thing is actually the best party I've seen in these parts in terms of actually having a working class organisation is the Scottish Socialist Party, because it actually had, you know, the working class activists. I mean, if I go into the Labour Party, which joined the Labour Party around the Corbyn period, I mean, the quality of people in the Labour Party in these parts is appalling compared to the people we had in the SSP. Just nobody of any real standing in the class struggle, you know, or with any record or any politics. Whereas the reverse was the case in the SSP. You could sit in a room and have all the shop stewards from every major union in the area will be in the same room. You know, totally different. However, the problem being, of course, is what you've also got, as I say, is a political degeneration of the left, whereby, you know, you have all of the different groups of the left collapsed into Scottish nationalism, which is essentially to say, well, we don't agree with Marx anymore. The working class has no. It's not the working class that will solve the world's issues. It's the creation of a capitalist state in Scotland. And you could, you know, there's you know, a whole list of groups that did that, which is very effectively declared themselves non-Marxist. You know, so as I say, it's those things, and you know, the problem being, of course, is actually just sort of in creating a party. I mean, it's how you actually solve that. Well, also, of course, how do you actually deal with the relation to the mass of the working class? And the problem is, I don't think the way that this is being posed actually poses that question properly. Thanks.
Thanks. Well, the question how we build a party is at the heart of it. Yes, where we're looking at particular aspects of particular times. We've got about 3 minutes each for you, William and Steve. Start with you, Steve.
Okay. Am I muted still?
Nope, can you hear you?
No, not muted. Okay, sorry. Well, just to repeat some things, but actually take them on a little bit. Communism's possible. We need a theory of revolution, because if we don't have a theory of revolution, which I outlined in my own contribution, permanent revolution was the idea, especially for Tina, because she likes it. There you go, Tina. Capital is a global system, but you're quite right, Katz, it's a global system, but it's different in Australia than it is here in the UK. It's both capitalisms. But the things that Marcus has to face in Australia are different to the things. The history is different. The class struggle is different. Therefore, we must address those questions as well and not just put it at the abstract level of capitalism. My point, I think, to Marcus was that the communists failed to fight for a democratic republic really effectively at all in the SLP, in the Socialist Alliance, in Respect, in Left Unity, etc. And, you know, I'm part of that failure, let's put it like that. But I think the idea that I hid my democratic republicanism, that nobody knows in the Socialist Labour Party or any of those people that I was campaigning for a democratic republic. I can see Tina smiling slightly. You know, that I've been hiding my democratic republicanism under a tree so that nobody knows about it, because I'm an opportunist. I opportunistically joined those organizations and kept secret my republicanism. No, that didn't happen, Marcus, I'm afraid. Yeah, and the last point was Republican communists. We have to fight and defeat the Stalinists and the Trotskyists if we're going to build a strong tendency that could be the basis of a mass party at some point in the future. Finish there.
Thanks, Steve. William, you're muted.
Yeah, just a point on what Marcus said about cutting the head off a king as a revolutionary act. The fellow who cut the head off the king was one of the worst imperialists that Ireland ever had to suffer. And I'm just reading the Republic, the decade of revolution. It didn't even last. After the third year of the establishment of that parliamentary control, he took complete control. He was a dictator, an imperialist, and a mass murderer, in the same vein as the Nazi mass murderers were in Germany. So I wouldn't be boasting about the great, wonderful Oliver Cromwell. We in Ireland know what he was. That's that. Now, as for radicalism in Britain, the Communist Party of Britain was set up in 1921. It made sure that anti-imperialists, John Maclean was the Scotsman that I didn't mention the last time we were speaking. He wasn't allowed in because he was, like Steve, a Republican. Other people were not allowed in. Now, they updated the British road to socialism. And they don't want independence for Scotland or Wales. They want a confederation. And they actually updated that now they are opposed to the monarchy. How does it take a communist party 100 years to decide they're opposed to a monarchy? It would only be a British Communist Party that would do the likes of that.
Okay, thanks, William. Okay, I suggest we do the other way around now. Kat, do you want to go first to sum up? Maybe 5 minutes each?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I've not really got much more to say, I don't think. I guess I suppose to reiterate or just finish off the points in response to Steve, I do think that when we look at these organisational questions and the question of a broad party, I mean, I hear what you were saying about if we're in the first as the vanguard, then we can get a hand in how it's going to be shaped and how it's going to look. But actually, the reality is revolutionaries are usually in the first, and the hand that they have in shaping how it looks, it doesn't play out as a good one because it's still premised on the strategy of trying to maintain this alliance with a bulk of social democratic forces to the right who won't countenance revolutionary politics being put on the table. So it's precisely the fact that those forces are in there first, sometimes before social democratic forces are even arriving. And they're the ones who are curtailing the politics. They're the ones who are softening the politics. They're the ones who are shutting out other revolutionaries from being able to argue for those politics openly. And I do think it does matter the distinction between setting it up and arguing it should be set up and intervening when it arrives. Because when we intervene when it arrives, we're intervening not with the purpose of forming our own little kind of trend within it. We're intervening with the purpose of trying to transform the operation and the behaviour of the left as a whole within those organisations. Yeah, sorry, I've just seen you post in the chat, Steve. Yeah, we're intervening with the purpose of trying to transform the operation and the behaviour of the left and the models and the political working of the left on the basis of those organisations, those revolutionary organisations, openly arguing for their politics and being able to be united on the basis of their politics. So when we intervene, we're not making the argument that this broad party is what's necessary, that it's what can accomplish the tasks of the working class, that it meets our overall goal of social transformation. But if we're the ones putting forward the argument that it needs to be set up and that we should be the ones setting it up, then we are arguing that that's what's necessary. We are arguing that that's the necessary organisation in front of us. And I do think that again impacts on consciousness, because it takes us further away from the argument about the social transformation that's required and the organisation of the working class that is required to do that. I think, you know, as Mark has said, if we put ourselves in that position of, you know, seeing ourselves as strategists who can kind of, you know, open the gates one by one to let the bulk of the working class through on the kind of road to developing consciousness, I think that's the wrong approach to take. And I think yeah, we do need to take these organizational questions seriously, in the impact that they themselves have on the development of consciousness, because I do absolutely fundamentally agree with you that is, you know, the significant task in front of us is dealing with the fact that consciousness isn't in the position for us to organise, you know, a mass communist party in this period. Yeah.
Thank you, Kat. I've just seen a question there. What comes first, the program or the mass movement? I think we can, the program can come now, mass to come now, but when the movement has to be ready to join a new communist party, that program. Marcus?
Yeah, when I see questions like that, I usually just answer yes. Which comes first? Yes. But of course, I think program and theory does come first in terms of how we orient and organize. And I think getting back to my original point and a rejoinder to Steve, look, I like Steve. I've known Steve for a very long time. I think we get on very well, but I don't really take his politics particularly seriously, because all of these debates should be being held within the same disciplined Marxist organization. And Steve had his chance last century through the communist rapprochement program. 2 weeks ago, he said, oh, communist rapprochement doesn't work. That's because you wouldn't join, Steve. So look, I think it does come down to program and the idea that all these broad left people have in common, who are secretly Marxist or not so secretly Marxist. I mean, I don't think the SWP hides the fact that it's a revolutionary organization. I don't think they're hiding it, just like Steve isn't hiding it. But they don't think their program, their full program, their minimum and their maximum program, or their transitional program, whatever they have, they don't think it's relevant to today's society, which means their program is useless. So we need a political program that is relevant to today's society, that has a minimum that unites people. Yeah, sure, people with social democratic ideas can join and connect. But some people, as Ian has said, some people won't be. This idea that workers sort of come out of the mud with bad ideas. People can join mass movements because they want to storm the heavens from the beginning. They're inspired by the ideas of communism. They don't just come out and go, oh, it's because I want to protect my community centre. Oh, my community centre is under threat from my local council. I want to stand in a, like, they've got this step ladder of consciousness. And I don't think consciousness works like that. People come to socialist ideas from all sorts of ways, and we need a full program to attract and organise people on that basis. And I think we do need a program of hope. I think there is a crisis of democracy. Yes, the conservative centre is collapsing, and I think Trump will be smashing through a lot of this at a global level. You've got Starmer and Macron, you know, looking like they're trying to repeat Suez, but in Ukraine at the moment from a much weaker level to hang on to their imperial ideas. In Britain and the United States, I mean, yes, Trump has won, but only 29% of people voted for Trump. 27% of people voted for the Democrats. There's a mass disengagement. I'm not saying that's left wing. It's very atomized. It's very apolitical. But it's hopeless. People don't have hope. And our program, not just our minimum Republican program, Steve, but our maximum program can bring hope. And that's what we have to do. And I think we should see the fight for party, the fight for unity, not for 1, 2, 3 different parties representing different fractions of our program, but for one party that engages with the mass social democratic organizations at the moment. And I use that word engage. I know, Kat, you said intervene. I hate the word intervene. It's for me, I just find it trot talk for we've got the real group and we're going to go and intervene over there. We're going to intervene in a strike. We're going to no, we are part of the movement. And Steve, I'm not a member of the CPGB,
Well, there you
by
are.
the way.
Well,
But so what we need is a party as a political cultural center, and we don't have that. So in the chat, there's been discussions about Cuba and Nicaragua and how good or not good they are. That's great, and that should be part of the democracy of a mass Marxist party. I mean, I did point out abortion is completely illegal in Nicaragua at the moment, so I'm not sure if Nicaragua is some sort of beacon of hope. Most of these, again, most of these are dead ends, although there are elements of hope in them. We shouldn't, and we should, those sorts of views should be welcome in a mass communist party. That 20% we disagree on, what is Cuba? Is it socialist? Is it not? That shouldn't be banned from discussion, but it shouldn't also be a point of splitting for us either. And I think that is the culture. We need a cultural change in the left, which doesn't exist. I mean, Steve, your viewpoint has always been to fight to be in a minority. You've been saying that to me for 30 years, which has never been my approach to politics. And Bill, I take your point about Oliver Cromwell, and I'm reminded of a song by the Pogues, Young Ned of the Hill. You know, curse upon you, Oliver Cromwell, you who raped our motherland. I hope you're rotting down in hell for the horrors that you sent to our misfortunate forefathers, whom you robbed of their birthright. To hell or Connaught, may you burn in hell tonight. And I do solidarize with those sentiments of Oliver Cromwell. But I also think that there has been a radical tradition in England, and that is the role of Marxists to make that part of our future. We can be radical in Australia. We can be radical in England. The working class, even in the imperialist centres, has radical traditions. And it is part of trying to find that political, cultural centre of a partyist movement that we need to do in the unions, in the Labor Party, and in these attempts to try and unite Marxists that across this broad movement. And that's what I hope you can all achieve there as a beacon for what we're trying to achieve around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, comrade. I really liked your summing up a program for hope. I think that's what communists believe the maximum program is, isn't it? Inspires comrades people to get involved in the fight because they believe there is actually the possibility of a better future, not just tinkering around on the edges. And we'll be discussing those issues in more detail. From next week on, we'll be looking at our history, talking about that, specifically how the communists got together in Britain and Europe and beyond. We're starting with Mark Mulholland, who'll be looking at the Communist Party of Marx and Engels, which of course didn't exist at the time, but they were arguing for one and getting involved in the struggle to set one up, a little bit like us today. Comrades, thank you very much for joining, and I hope to see you next week. Thank you, Kat. Thank you, Marcus. Bye-bye.